fishermen discovered something unusual on a calm morning at sea: a casket floating among the waves inside 7. As the pups continued to struggle for their lives, what transpired next made the day into a tale that would live on in the hazy morning in Bar Harbor, Maine. The fishing boat Northern Star sliced through the waves as the sun rose over Hull. With his grizzled hands grasping the wheel with the comfort of decades at sea, John Miller stood at the helm in solitude. His home life had become a maze of awkward silences, but the water had always been his haven. And unsaid words, the dense fog creating an otherworldly atmosphere above the ocean. His crew rehearsed moving the curtain that appeared to divide John's world from everything else around the deck. Inadequacy? But something about the air, or the way the seabirds circled overhead today, seemed different. Yelling their age-old cautions into the gray sky. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to please like and subscribe to our channel. Tell us the city you're watching from. Stay tuned at 52 John understood every Atlantic mood, every wind whisper, and every shadow that might portend danger or hope. But his knowledge had not recently extended to his personal life. More than any storm, his wife Susan's aloof behavior plagued him. He had seen how their once cozy house had become a frigid harbor of uncomfortable interactions and sidelong glances. "Captain." His thoughts were interrupted by his first mate Mike's cry. "There's something strange in the water port side." JN changed direction while straining through the fog, which initially seemed to be merely another piece of trash that had been taken and dumped by the ocean. But as they got closer, the objects, a wooden crate that was too big and intricately constructed to be regular cargo, materialized out of the mists. Hooks, John ordered, and as his interest grew, the workers hurried to set up. As they moved closer to John's breath, they were exact in their actions, even though the waves were rolling gently. It wasn't just any box that got stuck in his throat. It was a coffin bound with worn ropes that indicated deliberate positioning as opposed to unintentional loss. The team worked in complete quiet as water poured from the coffin's wooden surfaces as it was carefully carried on board, and John observed the craftsmanship of this. It was not a cheap container, but it was made to last, and as he got closer, his hands trembled a little. Fear, as with an odd sense of expectation that this moment will alter everything, Captain Mike asked his... The team huddled around their faces, their voices scarcely audible above a whisper, expressing the mixture of fear and interest that John he sensed, that as they carefully labored to lift the lid, the wood groaned in protest at what they discovered. 7 puppies of various breeds were huddled within, cold and wet but yet very much alive, leaving them stunned. A waterlogged journal with its pages stuck together, save for one, was placed in the coffin's corner for warmth. The inside cover has a readable sentence that says, "Please take care of them," the discovery caused the team to start talking, and John's mind was racing with thoughts about who would put pups in a coffin and set them adrift. So, why go to such intricate lengths? The journal's existence indicated that this was not a straightforward case of weather obstruction. As they attempted to warm and soothe the puppies, the weather started to change, and this was a message of some sort: abandonment. John realized they had to head back to port as the fog grew thicker and the wind increased, bringing the threat of a storm. However, something about this discovery bothered him. It seemed too planned and methodical, and the trip back was tense due to the puppy's need for continual care and the increasingly unfriendly weather. Susan crossed my mind as I wondered how she would respond to this strange cargo. Hadn't bought her anything in months, not since their relationship had started to chill off like an autumn night. As they got closer to the harbor, John saw something else. A little, strange boat, anchored close to the pier that appeared to be out of... He mentally noted that the location was somehow too fresh and pristine for a fishing boat when they docked, unable to get the feeling that its existence was somehow related to their peculiar discovery of Sarah Thompson. The town veterinarian was already waiting at the radio advance dog word, and while she inspected the puppies, she shared "This isn't the first coffin discovered at sea lately," which is a startling fact that made John shudder. There was another one a few weeks ago in a town up the coast, but what they found inside, she added, her eyes finding J and K. Let's just say that your discovery was luckier. John saw the puppies being gently taken to the clinic, each of whom was a silent witness to a mystery that appeared to grow more complex by the second. Couldn't have predicted at the time that this finding would start a series of events that would provide challenges to everything he believed he was familiar with, his peaceful seaside village. But it would also make him face the turbulent waters of his own. When John arrived at his house, the evening's long shadows stretched across his driveway, the day's events weighing heavily on him. The Victorian-style house that had once been his pride now loomed before him like a stranger, weighing heavily on his mind. As he got closer to the front door, he heard conversations drifting through the dark windows, except for a warm glow coming from the living room. Through a guy who was acquainted to him and another that was definitely Susan's, he paused inside and discovered Susan seated on the couch, conversing with a man named Sal Vore. The scene before him felt familiar to David Marshall. As he walked in, they looked up to see the strangely intimate coffee cups on the table and the photo albums scattered between them. No one said anything for a while, but Susan's voice had a hint of... He went by to catch up with David because he was just traveling through town and couldn't fully understand him. David stood there holding out his hand. It's been too long, John. His smile appeared sincere, but there was something unsettling about his gaze. David had aged his salt well. In terms of success, he was everything. John was no polished corporate land-bound man with pepper hair and tailored clothes. At least 5 years later, John responded, firmly shaking David's hand, indicating that before you left to Boston, he had observed how Susan saw their exchange, her fingers trembling as she played with the pendant she wore every day, a habit she had formed. David said, resettling himself in his chair. I was just telling Susan about my environmental consulting firm. Conducting some fascinating work near the coast. In fact, worries about the effects of industry on the reference to environmental labor and marine life made John think of something. The puppies, the casket, and the enigmatic journal. But Susan interrupted him. Before he could follow that line of inquiry, David's firm is... She spoke with a passion John hadn't heard as she looked into some strange happenings in coastal communities. Apparently, there have been a number of odd discoveries at sea in recent months. I'll pick this up for you. Someone found a giant macabre doll that must have been built by the Taylors. David's expression changed as Jonk's eyes' attention became more focused on the discoveries. Sincerely, I shouldn't talk about the ongoing investigation, but let's assume that there have been a number of odd discoveries at sea in recent months. David's face closed as he asked Jonk because of the growing evidence of organized environmental activity, some of which was fairly detailed. I heard about your discovery today. In small communities, news spreads quickly, and the subsequent discussion felt like David used broad language while discussing his work, avoiding specific details. Susan was listening intently, and John saw that she leaned forward as David spoke, her gaze captivated by his tales of corporate environmental responsibility. JN excused himself as the evening went on to call Dr. Thompson regarding the puppies in the kitchen. He could still hear their muffled chatter, interrupted by Susan's sporadic laughter, which had stopped occurring in their house. The puppies were doing well, but during their inspection, the veterinarian's news was a welcome diversion. She had discovered some intriguing small microchips in their collars. There is something different from the typical pet identification she had previously observed. I asked around about that after hearing Dr. Thompson say that her voice was lowering. According to what I've been told, the other coffin I referenced was discovered close to Portland and included paperwork about the environmental damage. Examines business records and the like, but the odd portion of the day is the casket and everything in the harbor master's office were discovered to have been broken into. When it vanished, John's imagination began to connect previously unnoticed dots. The meticulous positioning of the coffin, the enigmatic boat in the harbor, David's unexpected arrival, and his surroundings. When he got back to work, it seemed like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. David was getting ready to leave the living room, saying, "I'll be in town for a few weeks." He gathered his coat and remarked, "We should catch up." Fishermen are currently our greatest sources of information, therefore I'd love to hear more about your work on the water, John. After David left the house, he felt different and charged with knowledge about what's actually occurring in our oceans. Unspoken tension, Susan distracted herself by washing the coffee mugs, avoiding Jonk's altered stare. Susan finally broke the stillness between us all by responding to him. Some of us simply pay more attention to it than others did that night. John's thoughts drifted to the journal they'd discovered in the stream, and doubts tried to be seeking his mind. Stumbling across the journal just high enough to read it, he thought the casket was too wet to provide any information, so he left it drying in his boat. But now that he felt he needed to look outside more closely, since the fog had drifted in thick, and his questions were growing like waves in a distance, sorrowful scream that appeared to reflect the doubt that was beginning to emerge inside John's heart, he determined that tomorrow he would start his own research, beginning with that enigmatic journal. But he couldn't get the feeling out of his head as he went to sleep. That as the following morning broke, he was being drawn into something far more intricate and vast than he could have ever imagined. JN reached his boat with a remarkable clarity, the fog having dissipated to reveal a perfect fall day. The previous night's conversation was still reverberating in his head, earlier than normal, and the harbor was silent, but for the notebook was lying where he had left it, with the sound of distant seagulls and the soft wash of waves against the hulls. The remnants of its ocean voyage were still visible in the bright morning light, although it was mostly dry. John saw something. He had previously overlooked faint indentations on a few pages that appeared to have been written on with a lot of pressure. He felt the tail concealed inside the scratches as he ran his fingertips over them, thinking, "I might find you here." Now missing, he was startled by a voice calling out to him. Dr. Sarah Thompson was standing on the pier with a coffee cup in each hand and had brought you something. After yesterday's excitement, John thought you might need it. He welcomed her on board and happily accepted the coffee. After more than 10 years as the village veterinarian, Sarah's instincts about people and animals were usually correct. She took a seat on a bench and looked at the journal in her hands. As she sipped her coffee, she remarked, "The puppies are doing remarkably well, but there's something unusual about each one. Has a clear marking that is too exact to be natural, as well as the microchips I described. These aren't your typical pet ID chips. There's something completely different. John offered his thoughts on the... Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. You know, she continued, referring to the indented pages of her journal. With consideration, there is a method for exposing pressed writing that my father employed to restore documents. All you need to. With a source of light and the appropriate angle, they meticulously examined the journal's pages over the next hour using the technology they had created. With the help of Sarah's phone torch, the indentations gradually became visible as bits of messages appeared, including coordinate states, and Sarah pointed to a barely discernible hint of something known as Project Neptune's Watch. The name Elena Smith appears on the visible line of text. What does that sound like? JN was startled to realize that Elena Smith had formerly been a well-known person, until her unexplained disappearance 6 months ago among local environmental circles. Several articles highlight her involvement with marine creatures and her growingly outspoken resistance to... As they carried out their investigation, they noticed a shadow of industrial fishing tactics. David Marshall was standing on the pier, looking like a successful businessman in his casual attire, when the deck crashed across. John called out in a nice tone, but his eyes were riveted on his weekend outfit in the morning. On the notebook, Sarah, you haven't altered her stance in years. Almost imperceptibly tensed David was unaware that you had returned to town. He joined without waiting for an environmental impact study for a few local developments. John found an interesting invitation yesterday. Would it be okay if I looked it over first? Gray would like to see what you did. Could react to a disturbance farther down the pier. They noticed that a small group of people had gathered around the enigmatic 2 Coast Guard officers were inspecting the boat John had seen the day before. While a woman John didn't know engaged them in lively conversation, David's curiosity over the notebook appeared to. He stopped at the pier and said, "Evaporate well. I should get going to meetings to attend. John, we ought to carry on our discussion from last night. There's a lot going on in these waters that you would find interesting." Sarah turned to John when David left, saying in a low voice, "I don't trust him." Did you know that prior to beginning his career, he served on the board of directors for Atlantic Resource Development? Consulting firm that Eleanor Smith was looking at prior to her disappearance, the findings of the morning had left John with more questions than answers. The secret notes in the journal, the enigmatic boat, David's handy appearance, everything appeared to be related, but Sarah was unable to identify the pattern. As they worked, she described how she used the camera on her phone to carefully record the words that was displayed in the diary. To learn more about the puppy's unique marks, each one has a small sign that resembles Rand, but far more sophisticated. I forwarded pictures to a Portland-based buddy who works in animal identifying systems. Later that morning, John saw something while getting his boat ready for the day's fishing. There was a faded picture of Elena Smith beneath his windscreen wiper that made his blood run cold. In the background, almost discernible, was a pile of environmental protesters standing on a boat, wooden boxes that bore a striking resemblance to the coffin they discovered at sea. But what really grabbed his interest was what was written on the back of the picture. Some secrets should remain. Ask your wife about Project Neptune's Watch and the meaning behind that message. Buried at sea gave John a shudder as he gazed at the picture. A recollection that had nothing to do with the autumn breeze appeared Susan years ago while standing next to Elena Smith at an environmental gala. seemed unimportant, but suddenly it felt like a new puzzle piece that he wasn't sure he wanted to solve and Susan was taking care of. When John got home, she had her hands buried in the ground in her garden, seemingly attempting to anchor herself to something sturdy. The garden was bathed in a golden glow from the late afternoon sun, which briefly gave the impression that everything was serene. He phoned Susan as he stood there observing her, recalling better days when their chats flowed as smoothly as the waves. "Ah," she looked up, the picture burning quietly in his pocket. "We need to talk." Her face was guarded as she brushed dirt off her hands and thought about David. Eleanor Smith's demeanor changed subtly but clearly. Her shoulders slightly stiffened, and she stood with a noticeable catch in her breath and carefully removed her gardening gloves. She spoke in a perfectly neutral tone. "I'll make some tea in there." Susan walked with practiced slowness in the kitchen, which had walls painted white and faded blue, but John saw her hands. She shook a little while making the tea, and then she sat across from him at their white oak table and wrapped her hands. "I didn't suppose you recalled that she started that fundraiser 7 years ago and you were so preoccupied with the steaming mug." During fishing season, J.N. put the picture on the table between them, and I doubt you ever saw who was there. Tell me about Susan's eyes on the picture and her expression, which is a complicated mix of emotions, in Project Neptune's watch. She began by saying something positive, and at last Alina got the idea to safeguard our waters, not simply from harm, fishing, but she enlisted people from the large companies that were destroying entire ecosystems for financial gain. Anyone concerned about maintaining our way of life, including environmentalists, marine biologists, local fishermen's wives. John, did you know that I served as her secretary for 2 years? I stopped and took a sip of tea. I seen all of the study and proof of what these businesses were doing during your part-time employment at sea. What happened, John? Eleanor had evidence that they were breaking all of the environmental protection laws in effect. Asked while closely observing her, money happened, pressure happened, and people began withdrawing, taking settlements, and altering their accounts. But Elena refused to give up, so she began. Information was encoded and concealed in ways that no one would suspect, making the puppies John her insurance. John stated that the microchips began to fall into place as the policies identifying Sarah. Susan nodded, and Elena saw they were observing her. They would check her house, workplace, and computer, but who would consider searching puppy collars for encoded data? Suspected that a casket floating at sea had more than just discarded animals, and David John inquired, but, Susan continued, her voice tightening. I was starting to suspect the answer. He was always there on the periphery. He arrived yesterday, offering solutions and compromises, and I knew they were still searching for Eleanor's evidence. They were stopped by a knock on the door. Sarah Thompson was visible through the kitchen window. Pictures regarding the markings on the puppies that my colleague in Portland just contacted me about. They're more than just symbols. They're an advanced method of storing data. Each marking has information stored in it, similar to a biological QR code. She glanced at Susan and noticed that more microchips were connected to a number of offshore accounts with fake environmental impact studies and documentation of unlawful dumping. With proof of corporate sabotage, all of which are concealed in plain sight, Elena's face had turned pale, but she always assured me that the truth will come out in due time. John's phone buzzed with a text message from Mike, his first mate, as if on cue. You must come down to the harbor, Captain, because that enigmatic boat has vanished. However, they left your name on it, and the three of them looked at one another. The weight of the unspoken. The wind had picked up, taking the distant sound of thunder with it, and there were possibilities hanging in the air outside. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively, and John sensed that their peaceful coastal existence was going to undergo a significant transformation. Duh. Sarah remarked, glancing between John and Susan. "What should we do now?" John reached for his wife's hand, experiencing a rush of, "We did what we should have done 7 years ago," he remarked firmly. And we listened to Elena's words of relief when she didn't draw away. Communicate everything. As they were getting ready to leave for the harbor, John noticed some activity in the gathering as the sun was setting. By the time he glanced again, the shadowy person observing from the trees bordering their land was vanished. The harbor at night was another world, with streetlights creating long shadows that left only questions in their wake. As boats creaked softly in their moorings across the old docks, John, Susan, and Sarah came to locate Mike. Standing beside the enigmatic boat's earlier berth, with the watertight cylinder that, like those that sailors use to pry open the cylinder, Mike handed it to John, saying, "There's something else before the important documents that I found tied to the cleat. When the boat vanished, I noticed someone packing boxes into it. They appeared to be... When we discovered the casket..." John had finished speaking quietly. Inside the cylinder were a handwritten message and a single USB drive. "Once Susan trusted you, Elena still does, and the puppies are just the beginning." Sarah's tablet displayed the drive's contents, which included dozens of files named after Susan's hands, along with dates and coordinates. When we discovered the casket, John had finished speaking quietly from the screen. She absorbed all of the information she recorded regarding the disposal of industrial waste and the fabricated environmental reports. Endangered species, and when she gazed up at John, her eyes widened. They all jumped when David Marshall came out of the shadows while attempting to shield them from a sudden commotion coming from farther down the dock. In the shadows, his nonchalant manner seemed more menacing, and I hoped he would notice him approaching. He held up his hands to indicate that he was alone, but I would want to have it with me to help ease this conversation. In a more private setting, John took a defensive stance, but Susan restrained him by placing a hand on his arm. They moved to Sarah's veterinary clinic safe when she said, "Hey, he's out." Her voice remained steady despite her obvious tension. As the animals entered the room where the puppies were being housed, their gentle whimpers filled the quiet. David started to untie his tie, saying, "I'm not who you think I am. I never worked for Atlantic Resource Development." Looking into them through the undercover branch of the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, Susan dropped into a chair as Eleanor, our internal source, revealed the revelation that hung in the air like a fog of grief. "After all these years, you finally lost your composure." David nodded, and Elena's departure wasn't what everyone believes. She entered protective care, but she used her backup plan, the coded data of the puppies, before doing so. She was aware that no one would examine the coffins of the abandoned animals too deeply. Incredibly clever, huh? So why come out now? John asked, still wary, because David responded sadly. A new operation that would devastate the Atlantic Resource Development is about to begin. To stop them, we need all of Eleanor's evidence along the entire coastline, but we're not the only ones searching for Sarah. Who had been silently sprang up and remarked, "They're not just data." Each puppy's marking on the map indicates a different place along the seashore where Susan moved. She was correct when she indicated that the computers were retrieving the files from the USB device. Eleanor recorded everything with her fingers, speeding over the keyboard, including every fraudulent website and unlawful dumping site. Report all endangered species. Nevertheless, she divided the evidence and encoded it. A distant thunderclap interrupted her when she realized that each puppy's marking was unique and that they would never find all the parts. They could see lightning illuminating the clouds over the ocean from the windows of the clinic, so we're not alone. David cautioned anyone who found this out that a crew from Atlantic Resource Development is in town with that boat that vanished. It belongs to their detectives, and they're frantic. Dane glanced at the puppies before turning to Susan. Realizing that the woman who had just appeared so aloof had been bearing this load all along, Susan looked at him as he questioned, "What exactly is in those files?" To defend a truth greater than their individual hardships. John's evidence of decades of environmental infractions was sufficient to not just halt their new business, but had the potential to bring down the entire corporation. Eleanor did more than simply record their misdeeds. She also tracked down the funds. Sarah lifted one of the puppies and looked more closely at its markings after following the paper trails to identify all those involved. She understood that each puppy must be carefully taken to its designated spot. Kinar ensured that the truth would only surface if someone was able to fully decode the data at particular coordinates. Willing to follow her journey through to the end? Then that's what we'll do, Jayan stated resolutely. We'll follow Elena back, analyze the evidence, and complete the task she began, seemingly in response to the dog in Sarah's arms. Alisa gave a little bark, and then its siblings followed outdoors as the storm approached. Nevertheless, a distinct energy was fostering the sense of purpose that comes with finally opening the clinic. Recognizing one's role in a bigger picture, David looked at his watch and said, "Once they realize we have the John cut off our trip to grab my boat at first light tomorrow, Susan." Sarah is more familiar with Elena's techniques than anybody else, and he stopped to stare at David. The strategy was established, and you can ensure that the appropriate individuals see the proof. But as they were getting ready to leave the clinic, Susan drew John away in the gloom. Her expression was a mix of relief and, fearing there's more, she said what Elena had told me before she vanished, explaining why she selected this bay of waters, then looked at the others, before turning back to John. There is something in these waters that they desire more than their secrets, and it has to do with the dumping. Dayoa painted the horizon. In tones of rose and amber, the northern star sank as softly as John's yacht, the globe wiped clean after the storm that had passed since its inception. Susan stood at the bow, her hair blowing in the morning breeze, the air keen with the smell of salt and possibility. Sarah had positioned the puppies in the cabin, each one securely in place, and she looked more vibrant than John had seen her in months. She carefully compared their markings with the coordinates from a specially prepared carrier. David sat next to Eleanor's files, his corporate polish slightly weakened by the gentle sweep of the waves the first hours there. Approximately 3 hours north, Susan called John back at the helm, and Alina noted it as Neptune's cradle in her. Susan joined Jay in the wheelhouse, laying out a set of charts as they made their way through the morning mist. She pointed to an area suddenly marked in pencil, saying, "I need to show you something that I brought from home." In security, Elena found that the whole area is situated on top of an underwater plateau, and the distinct currents and a kind of fish that was believed to be extinct finds the ideal habitat in certain circumstances. What kind of fish is it, John asked? pointing out that the designated area matched a number of the coordinates they were using to find a certain kind of deep water, Susan described the growth of Atlantic resources, citing cod that generates an enzyme essential for specific medical treatments. They found it first, but they chose not to disclose it. Instead, they started covert harvesting operations, known as the dumping, was really a front for their actual activities. Sarah showed up at the doorway with an urgent look on her face, and one of the puppies is behaving strangely. She reported that the chip on the one with the star-shaped marking is sending out a signal of some sort. They assembled in the cabin and watched as Sarah's tablet showed a sequence of observations. She discovered that the shifting numbers weren't merely coordinates, but rather a timestamp that was approaching something. With a worried expression on his face, David leaned forward as Elena proposed a failsafe, claimed that the evidence would become encrypted beyond recovery if it wasn't correctly decoded within a specific amount of time. They all jumped when the boat's radio came to life and a recognizable voice filled. "Mike John's first mate, Captain. We have 3 boats left in the cabin. The harbor on your way, one of which is the identical ship that Jonathan saw yesterday when he looked at the radar." He asked Susan how long it would take us to get to the first coordinate as we approached vessels. At least she responded that she would examine the charts for another hour. But John, there's more to these places, Elena. They are not chosen at random. Rather, they create a pattern across the bay that resembles a huge net. Every point indicates a distinct section of the fish's migration path. Sarah's iPad beeped loudly, and the puppy, a fresh set of coordinates displayed on the screen as the star markings started to stream at its carrier and whine. Sarah declared in a strained voice that it was different from the ones they were going towards. Coordinates are changing, as if the dog is reacting to a... Susan hurried to look over Elena's files, and naturally she was relieved to see that the markings weren't merely for data storage. They are interactive and made to change according to Elena's needs. They knew they would be pursued and that they would need to find other ways. Because the radar indicated that the pursuing boats were getting closer, in response to the Northern Star's updated coordinates, John quickly decided to change their route. As they sailed, Susan and Sarah worked together to understand more of Elena's messages, cutting purposefully through the waves. Each revelation gave them a better understanding of the issues they were facing. The enigmatic fish species wasn't only useful, perhaps revolutionary, and its enzymes might be used to cure a number of ailments, but Atlantic. Because of the unsustainable harvesting caused by resource development, the species was on the verge of a second extinction. Susan described in an awe-inspiring voice how she plotted their travel and nesting habitats as a means of protecting them. Patterns the data in these markers, which are not only proof of corporate misconduct, but also a guide for preserving a whole species. David's satellite phone rang, and he moved aside to ring. My connections at the EPA claim that when he returned, his face was grim. Resource Development recently submitted applications for emergency permits to start conducting scientific study in this precise field. JN monitored the pursuing vessel's blips on the radar in an attempt to establish legal authority before we could expose them. The morning sun was getting closer and closer as it hung high over the ocean, burning away. The water extended on forever, containing its secrets, with the final remnants of mist ahead. The puppy with the star marking had calmed down beneath its glittering exterior, but its chip was still emitting its weird signal. SRA put a lot of effort into figuring out the pattern in the shifting coordinates. It seems as though she led us someplace, but even Elena's files don't contain Susan. Rejoined John at the wheel once again, her hand touching his. "I apologize for not telling you earlier," she whispered quietly. "I now understand that Eleanor had us all pledged to remain quiet, saying that everyone would be safer the fewer people knew." John answered, recalling the silent dinners, the verbal conflicts, and the increasing... The northern star persisted across the space between them, and you were defending something greater than ourselves. Waves, with its precious cargo of secrets and pups in tow. While pursuing vessels persisted in their pursuit, an ancient species maintained its enigmatic light. Unaware of the human drama taking on above, Sarah's tablet flashed a new set of coordinates as a message started to emerge, revealing the truth, one character at a time. Lies where the currents converge and the sun reached its zenith as it followed the starlight, the chasing vessels had dispersed, creating a loose net behind them as the northern star got closer to the new locations. Through his binoculars, John examined their pattern and saw something strange about their pictures readings fresh, the same degrees speeding us something specific, and they're not just following us. Take a look at how they're... Sarah came out of the cabin so familiar with our fiction screed, had been deep in Elena's files, her fingers speeding at except their left foot. He distracted building technology themselves. Super Good Used Biography had hired one. Listen to this on the tablet screen as she highlighted Elena's most recent entry. She writes about a place called the Confluence, where life makes its way to the starlight, where the cold and warm currents mix. Junk's eyes expanded in realization of the confluence as it depicted the route to the cradle. He reiterated that it was a location where various water currents combine, creating some sort of... Most people assumed that the undersea thermal well was only a fishing tale. Our researchers plotted it after the actual data, looked up from his own notes years ago, but we were never able to determine its precise location because it changes with the seasons and follows the currents. Sarah's tablet screen flickered as the puppy with the star marking started barking eagerly, joined by its siblings. She gasped when she saw the quickly shifting locations. They weren't random. Susan hurried to the charts to triangulate something, since each puppy's chip offers a distinct point of reference. John looked as she plotted the new coordinates and said, "The points make a perfect star pattern, with the confluence John completed already in the center." With a renewed sense of purpose, the northern star responded with ease, slicing through the waves as they got closer to the center of the coordinate pattern. The surrounding ocean started to shift. The water took on a new color, quality more brilliant in some way, with temperature-varying swirls producing patterns that were apparent on the surface. David's face darkened as his satellite phone chimed. He reported GLIL after reading the news that Atlantic Resource Development had just unveiled an urgent conservation campaign, because they assert that they are the only ones with the authority to conduct scientific research and safeguard species in this entire area. Before we reveal what's actually here, Susan realized, we must legally seal down the area. They can regulate access to the entire underwater plateau and the fish species once they have jurisdiction. As they maneuvered to encircle the northern star, following boats approached and made their intentions apparent. Through his binoculars, JN observed them, looking for faces he recognized among their crew's local fishermen. He replied quietly, "They've hired our own people for years." And the betrayal was clear, and his hair came out of the cabin once more, her excitement bursting as she spoke. "They're using their knowledge of these waters against us." The puppy chips and her typically composed manner are now in tune. Please have a look at this. She displayed a complicated overlapping pattern on her iPad. Signals are no longer just coordinates. Data is now encoded in the patterns of interference between the messages themselves. "Eleanor, you're wonderful." Susan's eyes glowed with comprehension. "Woman," she muttered. Not only did she conceal the evidence in desperate parts, but made a key that only functions when every component is positioned precisely as it should be. The water surrounding them had become more active as rival currents produce eddy and swirling patterns that can be seen in the northern star, rocked softly as it moved into what appeared to be the convergence center. And all of the puppies instantly started barking in unison as the data cascaded on Sarah's tablet screen. When chip signals peaked in the surrounding water, something remarkable started to occur. Bioluminescence appeared to fill the surface, producing patterns that resembled the star formation they'd plotted beneath the boat on their maps. Shadows moved in the depths with purpose and without threat, as if pulled. Susan breathed the fish while leaning over the rail at this very location. The ideal conditions are created by the warm and cold currents in their breeding site. Not only did Eleanor locate them, but she also found their weakest point, which John verified was the secret to their survival. Their position in relation to the chasing boats. They might have had a few minutes left before being encircled, but as he saw the waters surrounding them, he realized they had already discovered the answer to the question. It was how to keep it safe. The star-marked puppy threw itself at its carrier once more. Its chip-releasing Obserious tablet started to pulse steadily as a last message from Eleanor started to appear. The truth, as if life itself were to emerge, yet it requires guardians. Drew, who was close to Jane N., glanced at his wife and said, "To protect it until it's strong enough to survive on its own." Observing in her eyes the same resolve that had prompted Eleanor to take such drastic measures to safeguard. Here, they both understood that what transpired would decide not just their own fate, but also the fate of something. The ocean surrounding them, which was far bigger than they were, kept up its ethereal exhibition, which was evidence of the mysteries that persisted in the world, mysteries that some would take advantage of and others would sacrifice their lives to defend the Northern Star. As the focal point of the confluence, Star kept its residents united in their dedication to implementing Alina's plan. The pursuing boats circled the Northern Star in a tight circle until it was over. Their motors idling in complete silence, the skipper of the closest ship in the glowing waters. Last opportunity, Miller Pete had coffee with Anderson, a third-generation fisherman, during winter storms. Contacted companies across the river that were willing to pay a fair price for those puppies and anything else you had on board, but one must be aware of all of this. Susan moved to the edge, and Pete could easily hear her speech over the lake. Examine what's going on in these waters. It's no longer about money. The bioluminescence had increased, producing what appeared to be intentional concentric circle designs that rippled outward from there. Now, Sarah's tablet was displaying Elena's data on a bigger screen that they had installed in the cabin. Sarah revealed the whole extent of what they had found. The she voice full with amazement. They're not only unique, they're smart. And the patent they're making is a response to Elena didn't simply examine the signals from the puppy chips. She also figured out how to talk to them. David was quickly recording everything with his camera. This is more than the EPA could have ever dreamed. Created a sophisticated social system perhaps even a type of collective intelligence, which is why the company seeks to regulate access. In addition to collecting enzymes, they are researching potentially valuable cognitive processes. The puppy with the star marking abruptly broke free from its carrier and ran to the bow of the boat, costing billions of millions. All 7 puppies were followed by their siblings, who positioned themselves along the rail and pulsed their chips in time with the Susan's fingers skimmed over Elena's data on the marine display below. Elena found that the fish employ bioluminescence for purposes other than communication. She claimed immediately. The patterns we're observing show that they're erecting a barrier around their mating areas to safeguard their offspring. A fresh voice sliced through the water with a slick, corporate, and intriguing sound. Chief of Resource Developments for the Atlantic, Mrs. Miller Thomas Reynolds, an operations officer, was standing on the deck of a recently arrived sleek vessel. Shall we now talk about the terms of the transfer? After learning that, John stood next to his wife and put his hand in hers. Reynolds, there won't be any transfer because this isn't yours, ours, or anybody else's. Eleanor recognized that. Reynolds retorted, his smile never reaching his eyes. Eleanor Smith was a romantic fool. She believed she could. The truth is that some discoveries are too precious to be left to idealists, as demonstrated by the stop progress with puppies and light shows. Puppies started barking simultaneously, amplifying the water with their chip signals. The bioluminescent patterns surrounding the northern star changed, creating what appeared to be a protective panic. Sarah came out of the hut in a circle of light, her face elated. Her expression conveyed urgency as she stood on their porch with what looked to be a tablet computer. Sarah responded, "I need to see this." After being granted access, she set the tablet on the kitchen table and brought up a number of completed. She discreetly declared that Eleanor's whole database had been decrypted. Every unlawful activity, fabricated report, and business choice that resulted in this point is already being uploaded to. David held up his phone to display the stream of incoming calls from several secure servers. Communications from the International Maritime Commission and the EPA Oceanic Protection Agency, in addition to footage of what's happening right now, they're all getting it in real time. Reynolds' calm opened a little. You don't realize what you're doing, and these creatures have the potential to completely change how we think about just the medicinal applications of cognitive development. Neural networks and collective intelligence might be researched. When Susan interfered, Elena was attempting to create an ethical system with appropriate supervision and protection. The water beneath them abruptly sprung to life, creating a protected sanctuary where studies could be carried out without exploitation. Schools of the glowing fish started to emerge in synchronized patterns as they moved, their light producing it seemed as though the ocean itself was making a statement. With the breathtaking display that mirrored off the clouds above it, John saw as the crews and captains of the other fishing vessels started to retreat, unable to deny the enormity of what even Pete Anderson's grizzled face displayed a mixture of amazement and embarrassment. As he turned his ship, Reynolds stayed away from the scene, his face tightening. "This isn't over," he said. "You have no legal authority. The EPA just announced this," and David actually stopped talking while holding up his phone. "Entire region as a marine sanctuary, with immediate effect, conservation status. Depending on our evidence, unapproved vessels must leave the region or risk." Before Renal ordered the corporate boat to leave due to federal penalties, it remained for a few time longer. As they left, Susan turned to face John, her eyes filled with tears. which Elena knew she was whispering. She picked this location where the puppies had settled because she knew we would understand once we saw it for ourselves. Sarah continued to eat their chips while softly pulsing in time with the water image. David was already recording everything for scientific review while working with his EPA contacts to set up emergency safety procedures as the sun started to drop, illuminating the glowing rivers. John gazed at his wife with fresh insight into all those years when you were busy and far away. I was attempting to preserve something lovely. Please pardon me for keeping it a secret. She completed something greater than us. A recent growth in the water interrupted John's response. It was a pattern they had not before noticed, spreading out from. The new pattern spreading across the water's surface at the confluence was unlike anything else. It was like a message written in light. They had previously witnessed geometric forms that appeared to pulse and elaborate spirals. Sarah's tablet started taking previously unheard-of data readings from the puppy's microchip with their own inner rhythm, while the animals themselves sat motionless, gazing at the exhibit with an expression of almost reverent attentiveness. Susan yelled out at this time, pointing to a sequence in Alina's files that she had just decrypted. It's recorded them months before, referring to them as the archive. Based on her observations, the fish passed through these displays, knowledge passed down through the generations. David was on his satellite phone right away, collaborating with Marina. Similar bioluminescent activities are being observed, according to reports from biologists and environmental specialists. He said, "It's like they're responding to what's happening here." The northern star held up and down the shore. Their location at the center of the confluence, where the water surrounding them turned into a canvas as darkness descended, of living light, JN watched from the front as his wife and Sarah worked to record everything from the distance that had developed between them over the previous few months. It suddenly made obvious sense why Susan hadn't been avoiding him. Susan whispered softly, reading from the iPad. Eleanor's last entry wrote that the patterns are a library that includes information about Mig, in addition to being a means of communication. The fish are actually penning their migration routes, feeding places, and safe havens. Their past, in light of the fact that the chips are synchronizing, Sarah noticed an odd response from the puppies. It appears that Elena was able to convert their bioluminescent language into data based on the patterns she saw, was able to comprehend a tiny boat coming from Bar Harbor, Mike John's first mate carrying supplies, and news from shore. His face was one of amazement as he cautiously cruised alongside the Northern Star. As he came aboard, he recounted the scene around them. The whole town is talking. Words were circulating about what some of the local fishermen, who worked with Atlantic Resource Development, are coming here because of how well they were doing. Forward sharing their knowledge, John assisted in securing the supply lines, while Mike carried on with his update. Additionally, an hour ago, a woman who claimed to have worked with A. Smith was at the harbor master's office. Susan's hands trembled as he handed her a sealed package, saying, "I left this for you." She opened it a little and found a handwritten note and one picture inside. Elena was seen in the picture standing on a beach at sunset with what appeared to be early development blocks under her toe, the quiggly red dot. She was joined by parents segregated, and they reacted by joining together to form a whirlpool-sized sand. The patterns you're currently seeing are only the beginning of what these creatures have been attempting to impart their wisdom to us for ages. But we weren't prepared to comprehend that the puppies were my method of establishing a link between our world and theirs, keeping them secure and allowing them to guide you to ever more amazing discoveries, Eleanor. As they evaluated the note's implications, they realized that the puppies weren't merely conveying information about corporate misconduct. They were involved in a broader interspecies communication experiment, which is why she selected. Sarah became aware of the puppies' ability to attach, their intelligence, and their capability to comprehend and react to complicated signals. Helena wasn't merely concealing data. She was also constructing guardians who could comprehend and safeguard these waters, as though the bioluminescent display were reacting to what she said. Increased, creating what seemed like a map of the ocean floor around it. David immediately likened it to the official documents collected by the FCS. These are places we were unaware of, according to maritime charts, he remarked in a voice. Exciting locations that include secret reefs, heat vents, and underwater caverns might be essential for safeguarding these animals and conducting accurate research on them. John observed Susan closely, recorded every new pattern as her face was lit by the water's ethereal light, recalling their first years together and how she had always been captivated by the mysteries of the ocean, spending hours strolling along the shore and gathering specimens for her own study. "And you understand what that means," he whispered quietly to her. "From this point on, Susan, everything changes." Nodded, but her face was calm. She said, "Everything has already been said. I feel like I'm right where I should be for the first time in months." The puppies had started to react to their chips were creating a pattern in the water, sending out a melodic series of signals that Sarah quickly recorded. As the night grew darker, data gushing across her tablet indicated that something extraordinary was about to happen. The Northern Star continued to be at the core of a developing enigma that would alter their perception of the world. The lights in the water appeared to dance with possibilities, not only of the ocean, but of communication itself. The night grew deeper, but sleep was still a long way off, and each pattern or phrase in a language they were just starting to understand. Who could have imagined that the bioluminescent display on board the Northern Star had become even more remarkable? Radiating outward from the confluence in concentric circles of light, each of which has unique patterns that Sarah and Susan worked quickly to chronicle in her eyes, whispering to herself as she worked. Her eyes focused on. Each pattern indicates a distinct aspect of the tablet where ears' translation algorithms were processing the displays. According to their tale, the puppies had lined up on the deck in an exact pattern, their chips vibrating with the Giorgio constellation. The one with the star marking, which they had begun referring to as Atlas, appeared to be coordinating their oceanic light show. Reacts to its signals, which always come before new water patterns. David, who had been in close contact with his EPA contacts, came out to announce that they had research. He stated that major marine biology centers along the coast were sending out vessels, but they have consented to keep a safe distance until we have a better understanding of what's going on. John looked at the radar and noted with relief that the business boats had kept their distance, but he was drawn to some tiny fishing boats. Dozens of them were visible near the display's boundaries, keeping a polite distance from the Confluence Mike, who had been keeping an eye on radio conversations that clarified phrases that were circulating in the fishing community. They were visiting, observe it firsthand, and he was hesitant to safeguard it. These are families who have been fishing in these waters for generations are aware of the risks. Sarah came out of the cabin. According to recent research, the patterns we're observing are cyclical rather than random, with minor variances in each path. She seems to have looked for the correct phrases each time they repeat, as if they're training us to interpret their language, and as though to validate her theory, a new, easier pattern appeared in the water. I'm more methodical, almost like a primer. These puppies instantly responded to their, "Look at this," Susan shouted out, pointing to her screen as chips began to send signals that matched the rhythm of the lights. Something similar is mentioned in Elena's notebooks, which she dubbed learning sequences. John saw his wife working and thought the fish used these patterns to teach their young how to communicate. The desire that had looked to diminish during their marriage had not vanished, but rather had been directed into a new light. A little boat slowly approached from the gathering, carrying something bigger that may permanently alter their existence. As the fleet of onlookers approached, John identified Pete Anderson as the A fisherman who had formerly worked for the company, had a worried expression on his face, and something that seemed, sadly, Pete's quiet cry was heard as John assisted him in boarding. Pete took out a battered logbook that he had been using to record odd occurrences he had witnessed out here over the years, and realized how the lights in the water caused the fish to act strangely. The company advised us to disregard it, claiming it was merely a natural occurrence. However, based on what I've seen tonight, the book had years of meticulous observations, dates, places, and primitive illustrations of corresponding light patterns. What they saw now was that, without realizing it, Pete had been recording the fish's attempts to communicate for years. Sarah added, Pete had a brilliant intelligence for sorting out fish's attacks on people that we had scoured over the last few months. This is amazing, she said, adding that we can begin using this historical record to recognize how their communication styles have changed with time. The puppies abruptly became vigilant, and focus was drawn to a recent development in the water. The bee bioluminescent show had started to create what appeared to similar to the intricate mathematical sequences of golden ratios and Fibonacci spirals. Eleanor suspected that Susan was pulling up while dancing in the living light. Pertinent files, she thought that their correspondence was about more than just exchanging information. Comprehending spatial linkages and complicated mathematical concepts. The corporate board of Atlantic Resource Development received an urgent update on David's satellite phone. Is in emergency meetings, stating that our proof has led to a sharp decline in their shares, and they are being questioned by several federal agencies. But the corporate drama appeared remote and inconsequential in comparison to what was to occur. As it unfolded around them, the sea had transformed into a canvas for something they had never understood before. Display of intricacy and intelligence that went against everything they believed to be true. Communication and consciousness. Atlas, the star-marked puppy, came up to Susan and put a paw on Eleanor's final protocols, started to unlock on her tablet. Displaying the cosmos, the chips weren't merely delivering data. They were made to change, learn, and adapt according to her full vision. As the night drew on, additional boats came to see the animals they were assisting in protecting. Every pattern of light in the ocean appeared to pulse with possibilities, like a word in a speech. Humanity was only starting to merge, and in the middle of it all, the Northern Star maintained its inhabitants, acting as observers at a turning point that would reverberate far beyond these waters. Eleanor was aware of Susan's quiet statement to John, knowing that once people saw this, truly believed that everything would change, which is why she went to such efforts to safeguard it, rather than only expose corporations. Misconduct, but the puppies gathered near the bow to get us ready for this time. their chips pulsating in time with the oceanic show, as though they were conveying more than simply a message. As dawn drew near, the Northern Star had emerged as the focal point of the discussion. An unplanned armada of fishing vessels surrounded the confluence in a protective circle, with their crews keeping a respectful quiet while the bioluminescent spectacle carried on with its captivating dance. If anything, the convergence of natural and supernatural light was made even more spectacular by the morning light, produced something even more amazing after Susan spent the entire night connecting Elena's notes with the continuous patterns of light. "Something else is going on here," she declared, her voice taut with anticipation. "Are not merely repeating, rather they are changing in response to our attention and presence." Sarah's monitoring apparatus verified that the puppy chips were now recording entirely new types of information. As they engaged with the oceanic spectacle, the signals grew increasingly intricate. Atlas, the pack leader, had taken standing at the bow with its focus on something below the surface. David yelled, "Look at this!" indicating a patch of water where the patterns had changed to something different. Fish that were glowing had started to group together in ways that resembled the constellations that could be seen in the fading blue light. They comprehend more than just mathematics in the starry sky above, Susan said as her fingers flew over her Eleanor's notes. Indicate that they employed the stars, which they are demonstrating to us on the tablet. As more boats arrived, not just for local fishing, to direct their migrations, just like the ancient sailors John observed. Vessels now, but the morning news helicopters would come while the research ships kept the distance they had pledged. He quickly discovered, although for the time being, this moment belonged to those who had always understood, that these Pete Andersons of Waters had spent the night showing Sarah the contents of his logbooks and highlighting trends he'd, as we've all seen over the years. He spoke in a deep, harsh voice filled with emotion. We all knew that these waters carried secrets, but we were unwilling to acknowledge them. The puppies abruptly grew agitated, their chips producing a strange smell as they were terrified of what it would imply for our way of life. A series of cues, the water surrounding the boat erupted in a spectacle unlike anything they had ever witnessed. L extending into the brightening sky, and a spiral of light that appeared to reach down into the depths. Understanding dawning in her eyes, Susan whispered quietly, "It's a bridge, Elena." Not only developed a method for storing and sending data, but she also managed to connect two different types of consciousness in the puppies. Are not only conveying information, they are also serving as active translators in a conversation. David's satellite phone buzzed. Eleanor's suggested protections are being implemented according to EPA updates, and he declared the entire region is getting unique study provisions and being classified as a marine sanctuary. But here's the intriguing. They want us to assist in creating the study and interaction guidelines. Jan glanced at his wife and saw the significance of Perler's naval deposition. Elena made a wise decision, he remarked, grabbing her hand as responsibility settled on her shoulders. She was confident that you would get not just the science but also the significance of safeguarding something that this priceless Sarah had discovered. From the cabin with fresh readings, she said the fish are teaching each other new things in addition to simply talking. Pattern expands upon the earlier ones, forming a sort of curriculum. They are not merely demonstrating their knowledge to us, they're demonstrating to us how they discovered that the sun had fully risen in the morning and that its rays were now producing rainbow refractions in the pups had positioned themselves in a new arrangement while the bioluminescence was still visible. Mike came up with chips that were synchronizing with a pattern that looked to pulse with the wave's own cadence. "The tail is spreading," he added, according to the morning's radio reports. "But it's different. According to the corporation's fears, people are discussing wonder rather than exploitation or profit." Regarding accountability and safety, Susan was once more buried in Elena's files. Elena's expression showed increasing awe at these last procedures. She didn't only wish to preserve the fish and create a lasting relationship that would allow people to learn from marine life. The puppies are the first generation of what she named Bridge, and they are more than simply temporary carriers, builders. Everyone on board felt the effects of this revelation. These weren't merely animals. They were the first to use encoded data, a newly developed method of interspecies communication that was specifically designed to comprehend both human and marine intellect, as evidenced by Atlas's gentle barking. And the other puppies joined in as the water surrounding the northern star changed into a kaleidoscope of pattern and light. The fish below responded to their chip's harmonic symphony of messages with ever-increasing intricacy. Susan murmured as she watched the display, her eyes watering. "They're not just showing us their world, they're inviting us into theirs." As the northern star held, the early breeze carried the scent of possibilities and salt for us to partake in. Its central role in something that went beyond a simple scientific finding or environmental triumph. However, by mid-morning, the start of a new era in humanity's relationship with the ocean's deepest mysteries. News teams kept an eye on the waters surrounding the northern star, which had evolved into a confluence of more than just ocean currents. Their helicopters hovered just far enough away to avoid interfering with the breathtaking vista below, maintaining a respectful distance. Major oceanographic research vessels had mobilized the scientific community at a never-before-seen pace. Establishments remaining steadfast at the boundaries of what was now referred to as the communication zone. Susan, depleted but thrilled to have recently achieved a breakthrough in Elena's last treatments, which she described to the little group assembled in the cabin. Their chips aren't merely carrying encoded data, they're made to adapt and learn. Every new pattern they see is integrated into their comprehension. Sarah's most recent readings supported this theory that the signal patterns of the puppy chips were becoming more complicated, going well beyond their. Atlas, who was still at the bow in the initial programming, appeared to be planning. Sarah pointed to her monitor and said, "Look at this sophisticated exchange with the luminescent fish below." The chip's signal patterns are starting to resemble the organic brain patterns found in both canine and specialized. It seems as though aquatic organisms are developing a new language that combines several types of consciousness. John, seen how his wife worked with David and the EPA teams to create criteria for researching and establishing the corporate threat had been eliminated in order to protect the secretionary phenomena. But a new obstacle was figuring out how to maintain and care for this fragile interspecies bridge that Elena had created in Elena's final. Susan said that the note she referred to as the Confluence Protocol was bringing up a highly encrypted file, but it wasn't for the actual configuration. She was creating the foundation for a lasting communication, not only concealing information from the company. The water surrounding the boat abruptly exploded in a new, better organized show, creating a passage between people and marine life. And more methodical than anything they had previously witnessed, the puppies reacted in perfect unison, their chips radiating signals that produced a discernible resonance with the patterns of bioluminescence below. With a trembling hand, I've seen Pete Anderson, who had stayed on board to offer his years of observations, stood up. Some years ago, during a winter storm, he murmured something like this in a low voice. We all persuaded ourselves that the patterns of light throughout the bay were simply phosphorescence. The morning light captured the mist rising from the phenomenon, which we were reluctant to acknowledge, since we thought it might be something more. The boats that had come to see this occasion were surrounded by water that created halos as local fishermen stood on their decks. Many people were crying as they watched the ocean disclose secrets they had suspected but had never really comprehended. David Durant received a call from his bosses at EPA, who informed him that a new designation was being created, not only a marine sanctuary, but also the first ever biocommunication reserve, and they wished to make sure that what's taking place here is safeguarded and examined with the deference it merits. Sarah came out of the cabin with fresh information that, according to her, Puppies' chips are displaying something amazing. They're not merely translating the patterns they're storing. Susan was buried in Alan's files, memorizing them as if they were creating a live dictionary of this new language. She muttered that Alana knew that once, and her look was one of deepening wonder. Once this bond was formed, it could not be severed. Puppies are more than just information bearers. They are as though in reaction to her words, the first generation of what she believed would become a lasting connection between our worlds. Atlas moved from his place at the bow to face Susan. There seemed to be an age-old wisdom in the puppy's eyes, and the screen of her tablet filled with new information when he put his paw there, including not only locations and patterns, but the other puppy's complicated brain responses that seemed to represent emotional signs eluded easy categorization, had collected around them, their chips flashing in time with the show of the ocean and with one another submerged under it. The position of the puppies on deck was reflected in the arrangement of the glowing fish. Susan whispered, "They're showing us the way forward by creating perfect symmetry between above and below." John, who was crying, said that Alina gave us more than just the duty of keeping kids safe. She also provided us with the means. The morning sun had risen higher, but the mind needed to comprehend and learn from them. The bioluminescent show was still visible, demonstrating the remarkable nature of the Northern Star's development. Situated at the center of the confluence, its residents now realized that they were more than merely observers of, but take part in a discussion that would change humanity's relationship with the ocean's most profound. Despite the mysteries surrounding them, the assembled boats kept a polite watch. Crews realized they were witnessing much more than a straightforward scientific finding. This was the opening of a new era of human knowledge, one that is expressed through the hearts and written in patterns of light and the thoughts of 7 exceptional puppies who were selected to connect 2 worlds. The Northern Star remained in the center of the scene as the afternoon sun created golden ribbons across the ocean. News of the confluence had gone throughout the world, but in this sacred space of discovery time, the boats that had assembled had formed a protective circle, with crews working in shifts to make sure that everything moved differently. Susan sat with her gaze fixed on data screens in an undisturbed area. Alina is intelligent despite her fatigue, and her last protocols are remarkable, told the small group of people gathered around her that she didn't merely design a system for storing and sending data, but created a foundation for the continued development of the communication system based on Sarah's most recent examination of the puppy's chips. Showed something previously unheard of. Brain patterns are getting more complex every hour, she said. The chips seem to be learning and adapting, opening up new avenues for comprehension. Atlas isn't just leading, He was teaching the other puppies how to use the bioluminescent display, and they had developed new traits with trends that appeared to directly address human feelings and ideas when a youngster is on one of the water burst in spirals of joyful light as fishing boats laughed with excitement. Elena meant bridge when she said that the fish below were making displays that resembled the sound waves of happiness. Susan, the builder, murmured quietly as Atlas led his brothers through yet another round of encounters with the puppies, are assisting both species in understanding one another, not merely translating. David had been organizing. PROT OLS was established with assistance from international marine biology teams to explore this phenomenon without disrupting it. This is regarded by the scientific community as the most significant development in interspecies communication in history. Reported, but they also recognize that local fishing families need to be respected and protected, as John observed. Took their kids to see the spectacle, and their faces lit up with awe at these waters that had kept them alive. For generations, communities were demonstrating that they were more than just a means of subsistence. They were a Hope Pete Anderson's source of connection and wisdom, who had developed into an unexpectedly, Allie, who was recording the phenomena, told tales of how the viewpoint of the fishing community had, he said, his wrinkled face gentle, "We always knew these waters were special. Tremendous passion. But we now realize that we are partners in something amazing rather than merely stewards of a resource." Puppies had established an amazing rhythm in which they alternated between various locations around the yacht, while Atlas continued to serve as coordinator, and their chips began emitting patterns that caused the water to show resonances, like Susan found that understanding was reverberating throughout both physical and spiritual space. Elena's files had a new section that was encrypted until the moment she departed. Directions, her voice quivering with enthusiasm, not only to safeguard this discovery, but also for the puppies' chips were expanded to include templates for building further bridges to create connection zones in. Sarah's monitoring apparatus detected new frequencies coming from the ocean's depths in other areas. With their light sculptures suspended in the water, luminescent fish had started to produce three-dimensional designs. Each exhibition of constellations born of the sea seems to contain several levels of mathematical meaning. They are expressing more than simply facts. They are entwined with emotional expressions. Studying the data, Sarah discovered that they're sharing histories, stories, and methods of knowledge. As the afternoon light danced across the water's surface, we came to realize a world we never thought existed. Local boats have started to produce rainbow refractions in the constant bioluminescence. Supplying the research vessels with food and supplies, the community naturally supports this purpose of realizing that what had begun as a mystery had evolved into a common movement, dedication to safeguarding and fostering this innovation. Atlas came up to Susan once more, his presence now bearing an When he touched her tablet with his fingers, the screen displayed new patterns rather than just facts, giving him an almost physical sense of wisdom. However, Elena didn't merely offer what seemed to be invites and suggestions for more in-depth species contact. Susan murmured, gazing at John with tears of happiness, "Give us a way to protect them." Provided us with a means of developing with them, learning from them, and becoming something more than what the gathering boats had produced. Their own society, where research ships and fishing boats collaborate to preserve the area's sacredness. As their parents explained the significance of what they were seeing, the kids on deck gazed in awe, also a reminder of the mysteries and opportunities that remained in their society as the scientific discovery. The bioluminescent display reached new heights as the afternoon wore on, with designs that appeared to reach both dog and pet. The pups responded with increasingly sophisticated signals from their chips as they went farther out into the water and higher into the sky, constructing data and light harmonies that connect human comprehension and transportation. The crew of the Northern Star remained stable due to marine knowledge, now realizing that they were a part of something that was, with its message of promise and connection, ripple spreads throughout time, influencing future generations. This wasn't. Not only was it about exposing corporate misconduct or saving a species, but it was also about creating a new avenue for The sunset illuminated the sky with vivid orange and purple hues as they saw and comprehended their surroundings. At the center of the confluence that the assembled fleet had arranged itself into, Northern Star finished its first full day. Rotational shifts that guarantee ongoing area protection while preserving the appropriate distance required for Susan's unusual correspondence with renewed energy regarding Eleanor's final treatments created a beautiful discovery. She informs the attentive people in the cabin that these are not merely instructions. Future plans. Eleanor created the puppy chips to serve as models for a whole network of bridges of communication across the oceans, Sarah's most recent analysis confirmed. This discovery revealed that the puppy's brain pathways had changed more than scientists had first thought. Continuing to hold his position as leader, he had started introducing intricate sequences that the others increasingly followed. Sarah pointed to her screens and said, "Sophistication, look at this. The chips aren't just processing information anymore. They are independently developing new protocols, which is precisely what Elena had anticipated would occur. They are turning into self-sufficient bridges." As darkness drew near, the bioluminescent show changed between species, taking on a deeper, The patterns now appeared to bear emotional weights that everyone could relate to. Even without knowing its precise implications, the present could feel as though they were witnessing the birth of a new David. David noticed that the language he used to coordinate with international research teams was more than just words or symbols, a common language of consciousness. John proudly and oddly observed his wife at work in the distance. Connection had developed between them, had given way to a more profound comprehension. Susan wasn't merely deciphering patterns. She was contributing to the initial chapters of a novel human-ocean relationship. Pete Anderson, who had emerged as an unofficial historian of the event, told, he said, "The odd behavior of the fish and the strange lights we would see at night weren't merely natural occurrences. They were attempting to interact with us at all times, and the puppies had created an amazing coordinated movement pattern. Their chips sent out signals that caused visual ripples to appear all over the deck in patterns that matched the displays beneath them. The bioluminous and field-like ideas that appeared in Elena's final thought. With that, now that the message makes sense," Susan whispered quietly as she wrote on her iPad, "not only are we learning their language, but they are also learning ours." The puppies are the key to preserving this conversation for future generations. When the sea surrounding the northern hemisphere, the glowing fish produced a show that was more spectacular than any they had hitherto seen. Three-dimensional light structures that appear to pulse in time with the Earth's own rhythm are being monitored. Unprecedented readings were obtained by the equipment, and the brain patterns are synchronized between species. Reported in awe that communication is no longer the only thing that occurs. Communi. In order to protect the showcase children's natural beauty, the boats that were gathered kept their vigil with their lights lowered. One was from a child who kept her tablet in a different way. One was from a ship's captain revealed its darkest secrets. A living light atlas came up to Susan again, but this time he touched her tablet in a different way. Patterns on the screen that appeared to flow both ways, not simply information being received, but a real conversation being confirmed that this is what Elena was, as Susan whispered with tears in her eyes. Striving for genuine understanding amongst species at night, not merely for protection, but also for communication. There was a feeling of opportunity in the air, as the Northern Star remained at the intersection of this remarkable discovery. The Puppies' chips, throbbing with newly discovered purpose, had evolved into more than just ambassadors and data carriers. Between worlds, David learned from. According to his EPA contacts, international protocols were being developed to safeguard and investigate this phenomenon. He revealed her legacy, which they are referring to as the Eleanor Smith Initiative for Interspecies Communication, will remain intact as the stars above them blend with the bioluminescent display beneath Susan. Looked at John, beaming. "We're a part of something bigger." Then she said something that would alter the way. Wonder brought the assembled fleet together as a community, allowing us to discover who we are and where we fit in the world. Rivalries forgotten in favor of something much more significant than territory or wealth. They witnessed the Puppies under Atlas's leadership experienced a moment that would change humanity's relationship with the ocean and all of its mysteries, positioned themselves around the deck to create harmonies of the continuous Etienne patterns above their chips. Light and information that connected the sea and the sky, between human knowledge and marine wisdom, as the bioluminescent display reached a crescendo of intricacy and beauty as midnight drew near, leaving everyone in awe. They were no longer only witnesses to a phenomena as they sat in reverent quiet on board the Northern Star. The horizon was painted at the first light of morning by participants in a conversation that would reverberate for decades to come. As the Northern Star celebrated its second day in the center of the communication zone, there were hints of promise. The metamorphosis that started with an enigmatic coffin discovered at sea has developed into something that would alter humanity's relationship with the water. Susan is surrounded by for all time. "It's perfect," she exclaimed, her voice full of clarity, as screens showing Elena's entire procedures made the last connections. Elena not only devised a method to reveal business misconduct, but she also created a permanent link between species. The pups are the first generation of what she anticipated would happen, not merely information bearers. Become a never-ending succession of interpreters. Between worlds, Sarah's last examination of the Puppies' chips displayed Elena's vision in its entirety. Her neuronal patterns had advanced beyond simple. Atlas continues to transform communication into something that is close to universal understanding. Taking charge of his siblings had given him the capacity to start intricate conversations that broke down conventional boundaries. According to Sarah, the chips are no longer only processing data across species. Presenting her readings to the audience that has gathered, they are developing permanent neural pathways. Human-marine consciousness linkages are exactly what Elena had anticipated would occur, and they are becoming more profound than the vortex bioluminescent display at Living Bridges had developed into something deeper and more understated. Everyone in attendance could now sense the emotional resonance of the patterns in their hearts, a clear line of depression of the first wartime decade of the Bronze, anxiety to be told of victories owned, the expressions flowing from their children, their brows flushing with awe and duty. These waters that had maintained their communities for generations, demonstrating that they were more than just a resource. Elena, a partner in the great dance of life, anticipated this, Susan remarked. She wrote while quietly perusing the last few pages of the deciphered files. We only needed to learn how to listen to the ocean's constant attempts to communicate with us. The puppies are not just translators who teach us how to be more understanding. With research ships and fishing boats, the assembled flotilla had constituted a permanent guardian force. Working together to safeguard this priceless discovery, a shared commitment had taken the place of the corporate threat. Atlas came to John and Sue to foster this new relationship with the water, and his presence now carried an almost... When he touched Susan's iPad one last time, the screen filled with tangible wisdom, with what can only be characterized as a pledge and dedication to maintain this interspecies connection for many generations. David noted as he worked with international protection teams that this isn't the end, and that it's a starting with what's happening here will expand to other ocean regions, establishing a network of comprehension that will alter the way we perceive our position in the world. The morning sun rose completely, casting its light across the ocean. In accordance with the puppies' continuous bioluminescence, their chips have now completely developed into their function as bridge builders, connected the sky-sea by creating patterns of light and comprehension. Susan turned to JN with tears of delight in her eyes, remembering the human heart. She asked me if I was attempting to shield something lovely when I appeared so aloof, but now I realize what the true beauty is, by sharing it and allowing it to develop and change us all. The assembled boats kept their protective circle in place. Now that the crews realized they were a part of something that would last forever, the Northern Star held. Situated in the center of the confluence, its residents are now not just historical observers, but also active participants in a new chapter of life on Earth. The bioluminescent show assumed a celebratory tone as the morning wore on, as though the ocean itself was celebrating this new relationship, and Atlas's puppies had grown more. They were more than only bearers of Alina's legacy. They were the catalyst for a shift in human perception. Jayan and Susan watched the mystery they had discovered unfold as they stood together at the bow of their boat. The separation between them had been replaced with a closer bond that mirrored the patterns of light and love. Bridge that was now in place between the deepest mysteries of the ocean and humanity. And so, where magic flowed in patterns of living light at the confluence of warm and cold currents, the beginning of a tale that would be recounted and repeated innumerable times over the course of countless generations in the eternal language of comprehension that Eleanor Smith had contributed to the development of close friendships. We sincerely hope that the tale of John Susan and their incredible discovery has moved you as much as it has touched our hearts. This story of understanding and connection, and the bridges we create between worlds, conveys a message that speaks to us all. Therefore, we've put together a particular soundtrack to carry on this voyage of wonder and discovery. And how wonderful it must have been. If you liked this story, please remember to give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. Like every day, we provide you with original tales that delve into the intricacy and splendor of life. And keep in mind that through patterns of light, the ocean imparts knowledge. We encourage you to leave your ideas and feelings in the comments section. Together, we can build our own confluence of comprehension and connection below.